Good morning, everybody. It's really good to see you. And it's very exciting to start this new course. It seems as though for some of you who have been in this ongoing seminar for a while, that this shouldn't be that different because I've used video clips before. But in a way, it feels very different to me because it's an experiment in what I think will be a new wave of teaching. And that new wave of teaching seems particularly relevant to Jean Gendlin and to focusing. This whole thing will be about Gendlin's contribution to thinking, to therapy, to experiencing, and his contribution being the importance of what we're actually feeling, what we're actually in touch with, what is actually going on, rather than what we're saying about it. And we'll go into that a little bit more, but the way that Jean puts it is that it's not what we're saying, it's what we're doing in the saying. And it's the doing that we may not be aware of what we're doing. And so there's something about that, what we're doing and what we're feeling and what we're experiencing in the moment, that lends itself, I think, particularly to video. Jean wants us, when he's writing to us in his amazing papers, the whole Gendlin library is open to you, and there are amazing treasures in it that have nourished me my whole professional career for like 40 years or something, and always find something new. And now we're discovering how many treasures there are in the videos that we have of him and of Carl Rogers and of everybody, of you guys, of us. This will be a video. And there's a kind of immediacy of experience that we have in a video that we don't have in something that we're reading. But for other people, that's not true, that there's more experience in the precision of writing. So we're going to see, we're going to see about that in this experiment of, at first I was going to assign papers to go with each video, but then I decided just to focus on the videos and to give you transcripts of them if you're a reader rather than a seer. So I think that that will be a very interesting way to go about things. So this week is our introductory class, but it's also about Carl Rogers and empathy and Jean Gendlin. And we have two little clips to show you, and hope that you got the other clips in time to view them before the class. But I know it was all at the last minute, so you might not have, but we'll have time with these videos. It's very difficult to read about process-oriented philosophy, meaning that Gendlin's way of thinking is a whole different way of thinking, and it's thinking with the feeling, thinking with the body. And this kind of conversation is a conversation that brings that process right into what we're talking about. So it brings together the ideas and the words with the immediate experience. And that's very difficult to find, and it's very exciting. It's very exciting to speak from our feelings rather than about our feelings. And that would be a little way of talking about focusing oriented therapy, that it's a therapy that where we're speaking from our feelings rather than about our feelings. And we could go on and from there, but I want to just give you a little structure. So we're going from this, and the themes here that we pointed out are that that it wants a relational home. That the relational home is a term that Robert Stollerow, a psychoanalyst, uses, that really it really embodies something about what's so important to us. That feeling of home and the feeling of being really listened to and speaking from our experience. So now I'm going to shift gears to our structures. You're invited to come on a little early to say hello. If you want to come on at 11:20, 11:25 while we're getting ready for our class and say hello to people, you're welcome to do that. I know some people can come on just on time or maybe even a little late, but that's available. Also, as part of making this relational home with Jean and with Rogers, I want to invite you to do some focusing supervision with each other on alternate weeks. And what that would be is that you'll be assigned, those people who want to do it, a focusing peer supervision partner, and you'll have a call. You'll decide on a time and then divide up the time like we do in focusing, maybe a half hour each or 20 minutes each. And you will talk about your client, and the other person will not give you advice, but will reflect the deeper experience of what you're struggling with. Maybe they could throw in a moment of advice somewhere, but that won't be the emphasis. It won't be about helping each other by giving each other advice, but helping to deepen the experience. For this course, you might offer yourself as a focusing partner, helper with someone, or you might designate someone in your life that you have a relationship with that you want to interact with in a more focusing way. So that would be how that would work. If you're a therapist and you're working with a client and you're worried about confidentiality, of course you won't use the client's name, but it's also not so it's not so important the particularities of the person's life, except as it is important to you, but more your experience of that person. And we'll talk more about that. But if you would like to try that, just put your name in the chat. And then I'm wondering if we have someone who would pair people up, and you'll just receive the name of the other person that you're partnered with and try that out and see what happens if it's interesting because we're going to talk now about Carl Rogers and Jean Gendlin. I just wanted us to notice that when we spoke from it, there wasn't really anybody who wanted, maybe one person who wanted to learn more of the concepts and ideas and theory. It was mostly that we wanted to live it together and found it such a rare opportunity to live these ideas, not just to read about them. So I want to notice that. We're talking about Carl Rogers and Jean Gendlin, and Carl Rogers had this lovely analogy that I've always enjoyed, that when you are working with a client and his whole big thing is empathy, what empathy means is that you become an ongoing guest in the person's house, in the person's inner home, and you notice all these things about the house very respectfully. You notice the shelves and what there's on the shelves and the pictures, and you notice the leak in the ceiling and feel what it must be like to live with that leak right over the kitchen table. And he's distinguishing empathy from identification. He says that when you start calling the plumber, then you've crossed over from empathy into identification. And that isn't helpful. You're no longer a respectful guest in the person's house. You begin to think it's your house. So I love that analogy for so many reasons, but one, because it's an analogy about a house. You're making a relational home with the person, but the person gets to choose to the person's what the person is after in the house. For Carl Rogers is what's important, not what the therapist wants. And in those days, in the days of Carl Rogers, it was sharply distinguished from the psychoanalytic world, where it was what the society wants, what the therapist, the analyst, as a representative of the society wants. So what happens in therapy is that I think it's more like the client becomes a guest in the analyst's home, and the analyst says, no, we're not going to put the table over there. We're going to put it here. This is the normal way to be. That's a pathological way to be, or something like that. So Carl Rogers was very much making a new paradigm by wanting the individual, the person, to be the center. And he called that client-centered therapy or person-centered therapy. And it was a time when understanding and valuing the and giving power to the individual and what's happening for the individual, the distinctness of the individual, was so important in making a completely new age. So let's take a breath. Let's take a breath while we take a tiny break, like 2-minute break, and then we're going to talk about Rogers and Gendlin and see a little clip. Okay? Welcome back. I'm just thinking about what a wonderful relational home we're making. Let's sort of start with what you think of, what you know about Carl Rogers. He was such a pivotal, fundamental force in the humanistic psychology movement and in our contemporary way of thinking about therapy. It's not fixing them up that matters. It's who they are that matters. I love that. Mm-hmm. Anything else about Carl Rogers? He's like one of those figures that everybody knows a little bit about. He is joked about. So he and Freud, I think, would be, the people that are most made fun of and most known. So he reflects or parrots back, as the joke would be. And that's what we're sort of making here, right? Together, that atmosphere of unconditional positive regard that he then shortened to warmth. I don't know if they're the same exact thing, but they point to what Rogers was expressing as the atmosphere, the air that we breathe, genuineness or congruence, and then empathy. And what is empathy? I'm feeling with you. I'm not the authority telling you how to be better. In Carl's essence here, to be empathic is to be walking in the shoes of the other, to take their perspective. But it's more than a cognitive thing. It's not just, oh, I have to look at it the way the client is looking at it. It's not an intellectual perspective as much as a whole being at home in the person's inner house and seeing what things mean to the person. The notion of empathy sometimes can be like, oh, well, I have empathy for the client and it's not working, as if empathy was this thing, that you have. I do see the world through the eyes of the other, as if it were one glimpse. And as Carl said, and as you're saying, empathy is a process, moment by moment by moment. The whole thing can change in an instant. And Gene, as a young student of philosophy, before he became a professor, found his way to the counseling center and wanted to work with Carl Rogers in experimenting with Rogers' ideas. And so he worked on the project with Carl Rogers that many people know about, of examining many interviews of clients and therapists after the therapy was over. We watching the tapes or listening to the tapes from previous sessions, and they could tell which therapies would be successful by listening to only a short part of a tape and seeing how the clients were speaking. And this is a research that's quoted very, very often. The the result of the experiment was that it wasn't the kind of therapy, the kind of theory that was used, but the client's ability to touch into their inner experience that made the difference. And Carl and Jean collaborated on that. So I think we brought Carl into this, and we want to bring Jean's relationship with Carl into it. What Jim sort of started that. And Arlene, what were you saying that I wanted to go back to? Empathy has layers, and this maybe could start how Jean and Carl collaborated. Jean was Carl's client and talks very openly about his therapy with Carl Rogers and how helpful. And Jean felt that that Carl's way of doing therapy was what can I say? Pointed in a direction that opened everything up for him. But Jean came at it as a philosopher, and he, in his growing professional identity, added this incredible, vast philosophical underpinning to Carl Rogers' work. Carl was not a philosophical person. He didn't think that way. Carl Rogers was he was very concerned about a way of being with people, and Jean loved that. But then Jean wanted to sort of look at what can we learn about that way of being? What is that way of being? What do we mean by that? Philosophy is a whole other way of talking, of thinking, of being. And Jean brought that richness to Carl Rogers' work. And Jean's philosophy incorporates Rogers' work, but goes very much further in many ways, thinking at the edge of so many strands of Jean's work, sort of incorporates, but then carries forward Carl Rogers' ideas. So when you were saying the layers of empathy, Arlene, I was thinking about how, Carl Rogers would say, yes, there are many layers of empathy, but Jean Gendlin would say, well, what do we mean by layers, and how could we articulate layers? And Jean was very concerned, as you maybe have seen in the video that we'll be talking about mostly next time, about the politics of listening. Jean was very concerned with the specificity of experience, not the ideas only, but how the ideas point to something that goes way beyond words or conceptualizations or ideas. And that opened up vast new worlds that were not touched with Carl Rogers' way of doing therapy. Picture it, this relational home, and then Jean's building this this foundation for it that broadens it and deepens it and also gives it wings. So I think those metaphors don't go together, but since we're not being logical only here, Jean's philosophy gives wings to person-centered therapy and contemporizes it in many ways. But there was something about, I want to see if I could express this in a experience near way. Carl Rogers was talking about a way of being that provides an atmosphere in which the person can grow. And this way of being, the therapist's attitudes, is a very important part of how the client can experience themselves and grow. That's an amazing kind of thing. And Gendlin, with his philosophical mind, wanted to know, well, what is that? Something about the therapist's way of being brings the client in touch with themselves. What does it mean to be in touch with yourself? What does it mean to grow? All of these are philosophical questions. And Gendlin introduced his own terms for what was at the base of this in touchness, with this power to have, Carl Rogers talked about having the locus of evaluation in yourself, finding your own oars and direction, oars meaning in a boat. So Gendlin was looking at what that means and saying that in touchness is this flow of experiencing. And that's, again, what do we mean by a flow of experiencing? And Gene spent his whole career, helping us to understand it. But then he always said, you can only understand it by experiencing it. Understanding and experiencing are one thing. The big disagreement that Gene had with Carl Rogers was Carl Rogers said that the client has to perceive, has to know intellectually that the therapist is genuine, positively regarding him or her, and empathic. And Gene said, I know that's not true, because when I was Carl's client, I couldn't imagine how this professional, middle-class American-born person could understand me, this strange. Now, I don't remember what he said. Maybe one of you will. This strange creature that I am, he said in something, but he had a word for it. But it was the feeling of, how could he understand me? I'm so different than him. And yet, what Gene was saying is, underneath in this experiencing, he experienced Carl's empathy. Gene talked about how everything wasn't about what you think or perceive, but what you know, feel in the body, in the implicit, and introduce the whole dimension of implicit. Before, people talked about implicit. People would talk about what you think, what you know, your behavior, your characteristics, your personality, which was very thingified, reified. And then Freud was so revolutionary in saying, well, there's this whole big unconscious that motivates us. And that was a huge explosion. But the implicit is not the unconscious. The implicit that Jean was talking about is having a sense of something, an inkling of it, a feel of it. And Jean talked about how he was different already when he would climb the stairs before he opened the door of Carl Rogers' office when he was a client. He was already changed because he was breathing this air inside himself of being with Carl Rogers. And even though he didn't think that Carl Rogers understood him, he could feel understood. And we know this as therapists, right? Our clients may say, you don't care about me, you only want my money, you go on vacation just to have a break from dealing with me, or something like that. And they think that this way, and maybe this way, but there's some way down here that feels that it's worth telling you that because you do care. And they're betting on your caring or something. So it's that implicit level that Jean introduced. We're going to watch this little video of Carl talking about Jean. And I knew that our time was going to get away from us, but it did. It always does. Okay, Katerina, let's watch this little video of Carl. Let's make it big. Yes, great. We need the sound.
Carefully what we mean by empathy and what we've come to know about it.
No, it's okay to start here.
To formulate a current description, I would want to draw on the concept of experiencing as formulated by Gendlin. Briefly, it's his view that at all times there is going on in the human organism a flow of experiencings to which the individual can turn again and again as a referent in order to discover the meaning of what he is experiencing. He sees empathy as pointing sensitively to the felt meaning which the client is experiencing in this particular moment. In order to help him focus on that meaning and to carry it further to its full and uninhibited experiencing. An example may make more clear both the concept and its relation to empathy. A man in an encounter group is making some vaguely negative statements about his father, and the facilitator says, "It sounds though you might be angry at your father." "No, I don't think so." "Dissatisfied with him?" Perhaps." "Disappointed in him?" Yeah, that's it. I am disappointed in him. I've been disappointed in him ever since I was a child because he is not a strong person. I think that kind of an example, does illuminate Gendlin's concept in this way. Against what is the man checking these various terms? Angry? No, that isn't it. Dissatisfied? Well, that's closer. Disappointed? Ah, that matches the flow of, I think, visceral experiencing that's going on within. And a person has a very sure knowledge of of that flow and can really tell when you're speaking to it. In other words, the right word taps the right label or the right phrase often taps the exact meaning of the flow that is going on within him that he hasn't been able to label or understand himself. It enables him to bring into awareness the real meaning of what's going on within. So with that conceptual background, I'd like to attempt a description of empathy which would seem satisfactory to me today. I would no longer be terming it a state of empathy, which was in my earlier definition, because I believe it to be a process rather than a state, and perhaps I can capture that quality. The way of being with another person, which is termed empathic, has several facets. It means entering the private perceptual world of the other and becoming thoroughly at home in it. It involves being sensitive moment to moment to the changing felt meanings which flow in this other person, to the fear or rage or tenderness or confusion or whatever that he or she is experiencing. It means temporarily living in his life, moving about in it delicately, without making judgments, sensing meanings of which he is scarcely aware, but not trying to uncover feelings of which he is totally unaware, since this would be too threatening. It includes communicating your sensings of his world as you look with fresh and unfrightened eyes at elements of which he is fearful. It means frequently checking with him as to the accuracy of sensings and being guided by his responses. You are a confident companion to him in his world. By pointing to the possible meanings in the flow of his or her experiencing, you help him to focus on this useful type of referent, to experience his meanings more fully and to move forward in his or her experiencing.
It has so much the essence of Carl Rogers in it, and also how Carl Rogers was being fed by Jean and what he was taking from Jean. Yes, the heart, I like the way you say that, of what the person is expressing. And the heart is the crux of it, the center of it, but also the feeling of it, our hearts, right? The meaning of it, the deep meaning of it, sensing that, noticing it isn't understanding with our minds that only. I mean, that's in there, but it's sensing, which that word sensing is so important to Gendlin because it both has in it the sensuality of sensing and something about the process of sensing. It's expanding our notion of empathy. And in Jean's philosophy, he talks about there are two people, but there's one interaction. And that one interaction we're sensing with, and that word sensing again is both you sense with your body, but you sense with more than your body. So Jean's idea of body is more than the physical body. And that sensing is the sensing of the well, in my language, the sensing of the us. Of empathy is not about just going into the other as if the other person were a separate thing and I leave myself and I go in there. It's not that at all. It's this entering into the us and feeling the other's part in this us, what they're contributing to it. I think of it as getting the ball in the basket. As I always say, I know nothing about sports, but when I'm trying to really listen in that empathic way, I think all I have to do is get the ball in the basket, which means, to me, it's my way of saying to myself, I need to find the words that will point to what the person is experiencing. It's interesting when I watch this and hear Carl talking about Jean's philosophy, it feels like Carl doesn't quite have the whole way that something is not a thing. The psychoanalysts call it reifying, making it a king. So the labels for Carl, at least in my listening, are still things, but these things match what is happening in this flow of experiencing in the client. Finding the label may be a whole other part that Gene would say if he was the facilitator in the encounter group. What would you call that feeling toward your father?
Uh-huh.
And the client would say, well, I don't know. And then the client would be looking for the word that is the name of this whole big thing. And Carl was providing some names, which is also a wonderful way of getting at that. But for Gene, the name of something is the handle. And I don't think that Carl really had that concept so much, but that Carl sort of had the experience of, that's it, yes, and how important that is to carry something further. Highlighting the importance of meaning. And that's a very vital part of Jean's philosophy, that there's a felt meaning. It's what it does, not just how we think of it. It's what it does in us. If the client is saying the same things over and over again, Jean might say to the client, pointing to his chest or something, is that here right now? Is it here right now? And the client might say, no, I'm just talking about it. But that idea of it being here, what does that, Jean might ask, what does that mean to you? I think about, I think it was a supervisee of mine or somebody else's, I don't remember, but the therapy got very bogged down with the client insisting over and over again that she was so depressed because of postpartum depression. And the therapist was saying, no, it's not postpartum depression. It's blah, 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 or could be blah, 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 but I don't think it's postpartum depression. And the whole therapy became this argument about whether the client had postpartum depression. And there's something a little bit absurd about it, but these things happen because it's the name of something. And I don't know if it was me, my client, or somebody else's client, but I had recommended or something that the therapist ask, oh, what is postpartum depression for you? What does that mean to you? And then a whole other thing opens up. Just that simple thing. What does that mean to you? How does that live in you? What does that do? These were all ways that Jean would point to that flow of experiencing. Another little distinction I want to make is at the end there, Carl Rogers said in his definition of empathy that the sensitive therapist wouldn't say the feelings that were completely out of awareness because they would be too threatening to the client, right? And I'm sure that's true. But for Jean, there would be a more important reason. What would that be? That Jean wouldn't say the feelings or the experience that was completely unconscious, completely out of awareness. So for Jean, I mean, of course, Jean wouldn't want the client to be threatened, but more importantly, for Jean, when you put into words something that is being felt but hasn't been worded yet, it opens up, it carries forward. If you put into words something that is completely out of awareness, it probably won't do very much, won't do anything. Now, sometimes it will, and you can try that in some way that might come closer to what the client could have an inkling of. But for Jean, it was all about you're saying something that will open things up, that will promote a happening, that will be a concrete experiencing between you. And you can try out anything. Jean would say, nothing's working, try anything, and then go back to listening. And by listening, he meant Carl Rogers' reflection. So Carl Rogers talked about empathy, and Jean talked about listening, which meant listening with the body, listening to the bigger thing, not just listening with your ears to the words of the other person. So we have just, a little over 5 minutes. I want to hear anything from you about the class and where you are. And we'll start from where we left off today in the next one. So we're going to watch next time the video of Jean as an old person reflecting on Rogers, and also Jean as a young person reflecting on Rogers. There are many times when Jean will say to someone in a demo, do you have that now in such a way that you can come back to it later? And he won't stop the demo until the person has a felt sense of what they're talking about, so they can come back to it. Well, I'm hoping that this can be a relational home that has a fountain in the yard that waters us and nourishes us and sparks all kinds of feelings in us that can then be brought into our therapy work. That certainly happens to me when I watch these videos. We're going to have to stop, but I just wondered if how was it different to have the class centered around the video rather than centered around the paper? And in a way, it was like Carl was accompanying us in understanding Gendlin.
Yeah.
Carl was
You,
trying to get a grasp of Gendlin's philosophy, and we are.